Hello there, fellow truth seekers and story lovers. How's your day going? What time is it where you are in the world right now? Whether you're listening from Tokyo at sunrise, London during lunch, or Los Angeles as the sun sets, I hope you're ready for a story that might make you look at the world a little differently. Before we dive into tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between fiction and the secrets that might be hiding in plain sight. Now let's begin. My name is Elliot Vale, and until 3 weeks ago I believed I was living the American dream. 16 years old, valedictorian track at Georgetown Prep, National Merit Scholar, captain of the debate team. My college applications were perfect, my future was mapped out, and my father was proud of me. At least I thought he was my father. I should have known something was wrong earlier. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs through our sterile suburban life in McLean, Virginia. But when you're drowning in AP coursework and college prep, when your biggest worry is whether Harvard will accept your early admission application, you don't stop to analyse why your dad has started watching the same news clips over and over again with the sound turned off. Dr. Adam Vale, my father, as I knew him then, worked for what he called military biomedical research. He had top secret clearance, the kind that meant I couldn't even know which building he worked in. His badge stayed locked in a small titanium case by the front door, and he'd set 3 different alarms to make sure he never forgot it. The man who raised me was methodical, brilliant, and increasingly distant as the months wore on. "Just work stress, Elliot," he'd say when I asked why he seemed so tired, why he'd stopped smiling at my academic achievements, why he'd installed new security cameras around our house. "Nothing for you to worry about." But I was born to worry. It's what made me good at everything. That constant analysis, that need to understand every variable in the equation. My father had become the most complex equation in my life. The high-security cars started showing up around September. Black SUVs with tinted windows that would idle in our driveway, while my father gathered his things. Sometimes men in dark suits would come to the door, never giving names, just nodding at me politely before disappearing into my father's study for hours of hushed conversation. I'd try to listen from the hallway, but they must have installed some kind of white noise system because all I could hear was static. Then there were the phone calls, always late at night, always answered on the first ring. My father would speak in clipped, professional tones about subjects and iterations and behavioural matrices. Medical terminology, I assumed, but it never quite sounded like the kind of research he'd described to me before. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in October. I was working on my MIT application essay in the living room when my father came home early, which never happened. He walked straight to the television and pulled up a news clip from earlier that day, some celebrity having what looked like a nervous breakdown during a late-night talk show appearance. The singer kept repeating, "This isn't right, this isn't right," before being quickly escorted off stage. My father watched this clip 17 times. I counted. He used to smile when he was proud of me, when I brought home another perfect test score or academic award. He used to ruffle my hair and call me his little genius. But as I watched him stare at that screen, watching a stranger's mental breakdown on an endless loop, I realised he hadn't smiled at me in months. He used to be my father, but something had changed, and I was going to find out what. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I made a decision that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the world. 3 days of planning, that's all it took to clone my father's security badge. I'd been studying his routine for weeks, noting how he handled the titanium case, memorising the angles at which he held the badge when the scanner read it. During lunch at school, I used the 3D printing lab to create a replica casing. After school, I worked in our garage with an NFC scanner I'd built from Arduino components and online tutorials. The hardest part was getting close enough to the original badge to copy its digital signature, but my father's new habit of working late into the night in his study gave me the opportunity I needed. On Friday night, while he was locked away with another of his mysterious phone calls, I used a small mirror to reflect the badge's NFC chip toward my scanner through the crack under his study door. It took 47 minutes and 6 attempts, but I got a clean copy. The facility was a 20-minute bike ride from our house, tucked away in an industrial complex that looked abandoned from the outside. No signs, no markings, just a concrete building with narrow windows and loading docks that never seemed to have any trucks. I'd driven past it dozens of times with my father over the years, and he'd never so much as glanced in its direction. The perfect cover. At 11:30 p.m, I approached the side entrance with my cloned badge and held my breath. The scanner beeped green, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside was nothing like what I'd expected from a medical research facility. The hallways were too narrow, the lighting too dim and red-tinted. Everything hummed. The walls, the floor, even the air seemed to vibrate with the sound of massive machinery somewhere deeper in the building. It felt more like a submarine than a laboratory. I followed signs marked with room numbers and security classifications I didn't recognise. Most doors required additional clearance beyond what my father's badge could provide, but I eventually found an elevator that accepted my access level. The button panel showed floors B1 through B4, with B4 marked Nucleus Restricted Access. The elevator descended much farther than 4 floors should have taken it. B4 was different, colder. The red lighting was replaced with harsh white fluorescence that made everything look sterile and surgical. The humming was louder here, and I could smell something chemical and antiseptic that reminded me of the morgue tour we'd taken in my forensics class. I found an active terminal in what looked like a monitoring station. Banks of screens showed biometric data, security feeds, and file directories with names that made my stomach turn. The computer was logged into my father's account. Dr. Adam Vale, Project Lead, Department of Advanced Human Studies. The files were organised into categories that read like something from a science fiction horror movie. Rendition units, active global deployment, behavioural replacement models, batch 1 to 15, memory integration protocols, success, failure rates, copy error protocol, emergency extraction procedures. And then I saw the individual files named with a format that made my blood freeze. Kanye, active, Biden, 3, compromised. Cardi B, 2, replaced. Bezos, 7, pending swift. Terminated. Each file contained detailed psychological profiles, biometric data, and something called iteration notes that documented changes made between versions. Kanye Biasev was noted as more compliant than Kanye's 4, but occasional glitching in unscripted environments. Biden 3 was marked compromised due to memory cascade failure, schedule termination. At the bottom of the directory was a folder labelled Vale Adam Original Archived. My hands were shaking as I clicked on it. Inside was everything. Medical scans, psychological profiles, memory mapping data, and a video file labelled Final Recording Before Replacement. I couldn't bring myself to click play, not yet. Not until I saw what was in Chamber 4. Chamber 4 was behind 2 additional security doors that my father's access barely covered. By the time I reached it, my heart was beating so hard I was sure it would trigger some kind of biometric alarm. But the facility seemed to be operating on minimal night staffing, and most of the security appeared to be automated. The chamber was vast, much larger than the narrow hallways had suggested possible. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, and along the walls were rows upon rows of cylindrical tanks, each about the size of a phone booth filled with a clear viscous fluid. And floating in each tank was a human being. They were all naked, all suspended by breathing apparatus and feeding tubes, all completely motionless, and they were all people I recognised. The first tank I approached held someone who looked exactly like the pop star who'd been in the news the week before for erratic behaviour at a concert. The label on the tank read, Unit 4 on reserve. Next to it was another tank with an identical figure, labelled Unit 1-Active- currently deployed. A third tank was marked Unit 3, compromised, terminated, and was empty except for residual fluid. I walked down the rows, seeing faces from television, from politics, from social media. Every celebrity who'd had a breakdown or a change of heart, or a new outlook on life after a stint in rehab or a mysterious disappearance was here. Multiple versions of each, some labelled as active, others as reserves, still others as terminated. The technology was incredible and horrifying. Each tank had its own life support system, its own computer interface showing brainwave patterns and vital signs. Some of the tanks had screens displaying what looked like memory upload progress, files being written directly into the suspended person's brain. But it was the tank at the end of the row that made me fall to my knees. Dr. Adam Vale, my father, floating unconscious in the thick fluid, breathing apparatus covering his face, feeding tubes snaking into his arms. The label on his tank read, "Original Archived, Do Not Terminate." Below that, in smaller text, Vale Fair 1 currently active, home assignment, Vale Fair 2 on reserve. I stared at the face of the man who'd raised me, who'd helped me with my homework, who'd taught me to drive, who'd been proud of my accomplishments. The real him was here, unconscious, stored like a spare part. The man living in my house, the man I'd called Dad for months, was a copy, a replacement, an iteration. And somewhere in this facility was Vale 2, a backup in case the current version malfunctioned or was compromised. I pressed my hand against the glass of my father's tank, and for just a moment, I thought I saw his eyes flutter, like some part of him, deep in whatever chemically induced coma they were keeping him in, knew I was there. That's when the alarm started. The sound was deafening, a pulsing klaxon that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Red lights began flashing, and automated systems activated throughout the chamber. The tanks began cycling through some kind of diagnostic sequence, and I could hear heavy security doors slamming shut throughout the facility. A computerized voice echoed through speakers I couldn't see. Unauthorized access detected in sub-level 4. Implementing containment protocol. All personnel report to stations immediately. I ran toward the exit, but the door I'd entered through was sealed, a red light blinking where the green scanner had been. Emergency lighting had activated, casting everything in hellish red shadows that made the floating figures in the tanks look even more nightmarish. There had to be another way out. I'd studied enough building schematics for my engineering classes to know that facilities like this always had emergency exits, service tunnels, something. I just had to stay calm and think logically. The ventilation system. Large enough for maintenance access, and it wouldn't be affected by the security lockdown. I found a maintenance panel near the monitoring station and used the multi-tool from my backpack to remove the screws. The vent opening was tight, but I'd always been small for my age. I grabbed as many printed files as I could carry from the terminal, evidence, proof of what I'd seen, and stuffed them into my backpack before crawling into the ventilation shaft. The crawl through the facility's ductwork was a nightmare of sharp metal edges and stifling heat. I could hear security teams moving through the building below me, their radio chatter echoing up through the vents. They were conducting a floor-by-floor search, but they seemed to be working under the assumption that the intruder was still in the lower levels. It took me nearly an hour to find an exit vent that led to the building's exterior. By the time I dropped down into the alley behind the facility, it was almost 3 a.m. I was exhausted, scratched up, and completely disoriented, but I was free. That's when I saw the black SUVs parked outside my house. 4 of them, lined up along our quiet suburban street like some kind of motorcade. Men in dark suits stood by each vehicle, and I could see the glow of electronic devices, tablets, phones, communication equipment. They weren't trying to be subtle, they wanted me to know they were there. I hid behind a neighbour's fence and watched as one of the men approached our front door. He didn't knock. He used a key. A moment later, the man I'd known as my father appeared in the doorway. Even from a distance, I could see him clearly in the porch light, and he looked exactly the same as always. But now I knew the truth. This wasn't my father having a bad day or dealing with work stress. This was Vale 1, a programmable copy, reporting to his handlers. They spoke for several minutes, the copy nodding and gesturing toward my bedroom window. Then the suited man handed him something, looked like a tablet or a phone, and got back into one of the SUVs. As the vehicles drove away, Vale 1 stood in our doorway for a long moment, staring directly at the spot where I was hiding. Even from that distance, even in the dim streetlight, I could see that his expression was completely emotionless. He wasn't worried about me. He wasn't concerned about his missing son. He was waiting for his next set of instructions, That's when I realised they'd known I was in the facility before I'd even left. The security breach hadn't been an accident or a delayed response to my presence. They'd been tracking me from the moment I'd used the clone badge, maybe even from the moment I'd first copied it. This was all part of some larger plan, and I was running out of time to figure out what it was. I couldn't go home. I couldn't call the police. What was I going to tell them? That my father had been replaced by a clone, and there was a secret government facility growing copies of celebrities and tanks. They'd think I was having some kind of psychotic break. There was only one person I could think of who might believe me, or at least listen long enough for me to show her the evidence. Mrs. Chen, my AP biology teacher. She'd worked for defence contractors before becoming a teacher, and she'd always been willing to discuss conspiracy theories and government overreach with students who were interested. More importantly, she'd always taken me seriously, even when my questions got a little too intense for most adults. I made it to her house just as the sun was coming up, exhausted and paranoid and probably looking like I'd been crawling through ventilation shafts for hours, which I had. She opened the door in her bathrobe, took one look at me, and immediately let me inside. "Elliot, what happened to you? Should I call your father?" "No!" The word came out more forcefully than I'd intended. "Please, Mrs. Chen, I need you to listen to me. I need you to look at something, and I need you to promise me you won't call anyone until you've seen it." She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her switching from concerned teacher mode to the analytical mindset that had made her such a good scientist. "Show me what you've got." I spread the printed files across her dining room table. Psychological profiles, medical specifications, memory integration protocols, and photographs from the tanks. Everything I'd been able to grab before escaping through the vents. Mrs. Chen examined each document carefully, and I watched her expression change from skepticism to confusion to something approaching horror. When she got to the photos I'd managed to take with my phone, blurry but unmistakable images of the floating figures in Chamber 4, she sat down heavily in one of her chairs. "Jesus Christ, Elliot, where did you get these? You believe me?" She was quiet for a long time, flipping through the documents again. "I've heard rumours," she said finally. "When I worked for Raytheon, there were always stories about black projects, about research that went beyond what anyone was supposed to be doing. But I thought they were just stories. What kind of stories? Memory manipulation, consciousness transfer, projects that were supposedly shut down in the 70s after the Church Committee investigations, but..." She held up one of the psychological profiles. "But this technology, this level of detail about neural mapping and behavioural modification, this is decades beyond anything that should exist." We spent the morning going through everything I'd found, and Mrs. Chen helped me understand some of the technical specifications I'd missed. The clones weren't just physical copies. They were being programmed with modified versions of the original person's memories and personality. The psychological profiles included detailed notes about which traits to enhance or suppress in each iteration. "They're not just replacing people," Mrs. Chen said, studying a file labelled Behavioural Modification Protocols. "They're improving them, making them more compliant, more predictable. Look at this." She showed me a comparison chart between different iterations of the same person. Each version had been adjusted, less prone to addiction, more willing to follow scripts, reduced capacity for independent thought. They were creating perfect puppets who looked and mostly acted like the originals, but without any of the unpredictability that made them human. "We have to expose this," I said. "We have to tell people." "With what proof?" "These documents could be faked. The photos are too blurry to be definitive. And even if we had perfect evidence, who would we tell? If this project is real, if it's as extensive as these files suggest, then the people who would normally investigate something like this are probably already compromised." That's when we saw the news report. Mrs. Chen had left the television on in the background, tuned to a local news station. We both looked up when we heard the anchor mention a disturbing incident during a live broadcast the night before. The footage showed a young pop star, someone I'd seen in one of the tanks just hours earlier, having what looked like a complete breakdown during a late-night talk show appearance. But this wasn't like the usual celebrity meltdown. The singer kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "I'm not supposed to remember this. I'm not supposed to remember. I'm not me. I'm not me." Security guards had rushed onto the set and physically carried her away while she kept screaming. The show had cut to commercial, and by morning, the official story was that she'd had an adverse reaction to medication and was seeking treatment at a private facility. "Memory cascade failure," Mrs. Chen said quietly, reading from one of the files, "is listed here as one of the potential complications. Sometimes the original memories break through the programming." That's when I realised we weren't just dealing with a conspiracy to replace public figures. We were dealing with a system that was already failing, copies that were breaking down and glitching in public. And if the people running this project were willing to replace celebrities and politicians, what would they do to a 16-year-old who'd discovered their secret? I got my answer that evening. I was staying in Mrs. Chen's guest room trying to figure out our next move when I heard her gasp from the living room. I came out to find her standing at the window, her face pale. "Elliot," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Across the street, standing under a streetlight, was a figure I recognised immediately. Same height as me, same build, same face. But this version of me was standing perfectly still, staring directly at Mrs. Chen's house with an expression I'd never seen on my own face. Completely emotionless and somehow predatory. They hadn't just replaced my father, they'd built a version of me, and it was watching, waiting for the right moment to complete whatever mission it had been programmed to carry out. "How long do you think we have?" Mrs. Chen asked. I watched my own face staring back at me from across the street, and I realised that everything I'd thought I knew about my life, about my family, about myself, had been carefully constructed by people who saw human beings as nothing more than biological machines to be improved, modified, and replaced. "Not long enough," I said. We had maybe 6 hours before they made their move. The copy of me had disappeared sometime after midnight, but we both knew it would be back. Mrs. Chen had helped me understand enough of the technical documentation to realise that the copies weren't just physically identical. They had access to modified versions of their original's memories. My copy would know how I thought, how I behaved, how I would try to escape. But it wouldn't know everything. The real me had been living with increasing suspicion about my father for months, learning to hide my thoughts and observations. The real me had developed skills and knowledge that wouldn't be included in whatever psychological profile they'd built their copy from. The real me had become paranoid, and paranoia was about to save my life. Mrs. Chen had contacts in the academic world, people who specialised in government transparency and whistleblowing. But every conventional channel we could think of had the same problem. If this conspiracy was as extensive as the file suggested, we had no way of knowing who might already be compromised. "Dark web," I said, remembering something from my computer science classes. "Anonymous file sharing, distributed through multiple servers, impossible to trace back to us." "You know how to do that?" "I can figure it out. It took me 3 hours to set up the anonymous accounts, encrypted file transfers, and distributed hosting that would make our leak untraceable." Mrs. Chen helped me organise the documents, and we created a comprehensive package that included all the files I'd taken from the facility, the photographs of the tanks, and a detailed written account of everything I'd discovered. We uploaded everything to 6 different platforms simultaneously: WikiLeaks, several investigative journalism sites, academic transparency organisations, and a handful of conspiracy theory forums that had enough credibility to get mainstream attention if something big enough landed in their laps. Then we waited. The first responses came within an hour. Journalists started reaching out through the anonymous channels we'd set up, asking for verification, for additional evidence, for ways to contact us directly. Several of the conspiracy forums had already begun analysing our documents, comparing them with other leaks and rumours they'd been tracking. By dawn, our story was trending on social media. Project Reflection began spreading across Twitter and TikTok, with thousands of people sharing the documents and debating their authenticity. Several major news outlets picked up the story, though most were treating it as an elaborate hoax rather than a genuine leak. That's when things got interesting. At 7 a.m, every major news network simultaneously received what they described as comprehensive evidence that our documents were sophisticated fakes created by foreign intelligence agencies to destabilise American democracy. Government officials appeared on morning shows to denounce the leak as obvious disinformation, and to praise the speed with which their cybersecurity experts had identified the forgeries. By noon, the story had been completely flipped. Instead of exposing a conspiracy, we'd supposedly fallen victim to one. The documents were being analysed by independent experts who found evidence of digital manipulation. The photographs were dismissed as CGI. Even the video footage people had started connecting to our claims, celebrities glitching during public appearances, was being explained as coordinated deepfake attacks designed to make Americans distrust their own government and media. It was masterfully done. Instead of denying the existence of the conspiracy, they'd made us part of a different conspiracy. We weren't whistleblowers exposing the truth. We were useful idiots spreading foreign propaganda. But something interesting had happened in those first few hours, before the narrative got flipped. People had downloaded and shared our files faster than they could be scrubbed. Screenshots, mirror sites, and backup copies were scattered across the internet. And while most people were accepting the official explanation, a significant number were asking the right questions. Mrs. Chen found me that afternoon staring at my laptop, watching the news coverage with a mixture of frustration and fascination. "They're good at this," she said. "Too good. Look at this response time, the coordination between different agencies and media outlets. You can't organise something this comprehensive in a few hours unless you've already planned for it. Which means they've had to do this before." I was about to respond when I heard the sound I'd been dreading, a knock at the front door. Not the aggressive pounding of law enforcement, but a polite, almost friendly knock. The kind of knock a neighbour might make, or a delivery person, or someone who looked exactly like me. Mrs. Chen and I looked at each other, and I could see the same realisation in her eyes that I was feeling. We'd done what we could. We'd gotten the information out there, and now people would have to decide for themselves what to believe. The knock came again, and this time it was accompanied by a voice I recognised as my own. "Mrs. Chen, I'm looking for my friend Elliot. I think he might be in trouble." Perfect mimicry. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed it was me. But there was something just slightly off about the tone. Something too controlled, too calm for someone who was genuinely worried about a missing friend. "Back door," Mrs. Chen whispered. "My car is in the garage. Keys are on the kitchen counter." I gathered the few belongings I'd brought with me and headed for her back door. But as I reached for the handle, I saw another figure standing in her backyard. This one looked like my father. Or rather, like the man I'd thought was my father for the past few months. Veil one, waiting patiently by the back fence. They'd anticipated our escape routes. Of course they had. My copy would have known how I thought, and Veil one had been observing my behaviour patterns for months. But there was one thing they might not have considered. Mrs. Chen's house backed up to a storm drain system that connected to the larger infrastructure under our suburb. I'd explored those tunnels as a kid, back when urban exploration seemed like an adventure rather than a survival skill. "The basement," I told Mrs. Chen. "There's an old foundation crack that connects to the storm system. I can get out that way." She nodded and handed me an envelope. Emergency cash, untraceable phone, and contact information for some people who might be able to help you. "Be careful, Elliot." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I'm just a teacher who got fooled by some sophisticated propaganda, remember? That's the official story, and I plan to stick to it." The knock at the front door was getting more insistent, and I could hear my own voice calling out with increasing concern. "Mrs. Chen, please, I just need to talk to Elliot. I'm worried about him." I made it to her basement just as I heard the back door being tested. The foundation crack was smaller than I remembered from childhood, but adrenaline and desperation made me flexible. I squeezed through into the storm drain system and began crawling toward the main tunnel network. Behind me, I could hear muffled voices as the copies entered Mrs. Chen's house. I hoped she would be okay. I hoped they would believe her story about being an innocent victim of foreign disinformation. But as I crawled through the dark, wet tunnels beneath my suburban neighbourhood, I realised that hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. The people behind Project Reflection had managed to turn my attempt to expose them into evidence of their enemy's capabilities. They'd made themselves the victims of the very conspiracy they were actually running. And now I was alone, hunted by copies of myself and my father, with nothing but a leaked story that most of the world had already dismissed as fake news. But I'd learned something important in those first few hours after our leak went viral. The truth had power, even when it was being suppressed. People were asking questions, sharing information, connecting dots. The conspiracy might have contained the immediate damage, but they couldn't control every conversation, every doubt, every person who'd seen our evidence and decided to keep looking. Project Reflection was real, the copies were everywhere, and now that I knew the truth I had a choice to make: run and hide, or find a way to fight back. I emerged from the storm system 3 miles from Mrs. Chen's house, in an industrial area near the highway. Using the phone she'd given me, I accessed one of the secure channels we'd set up for the leak. The conversation threads were still active, still growing. People were sharing their own observations, their own suspicions about public figures who'd seemed different after various incidents. One message thread caught my attention. It was from someone claiming to be a former government contractor who'd heard rumours about Project Reflection years ago. The message included coordinates for a location in West Virginia and a simple statement: "If you're the real Elliot Vale, and if you're still alive, come alone." We have a lot to talk about. It could be a trap. It probably was a trap. But as I watched traffic heading west on the highway, I realised I didn't have many other options. I was 16 years old, my father was floating in a tank somewhere, and my entire life had been managed by people who saw human consciousness as just another form of software to be updated and improved. But I was still me, the real me, and that had to count for something. 3 weeks later, I'm writing this from a location I can't name, working with people I can't identify, planning things I can't discuss. The world still believes Project Reflection is foreign disinformation. The copies are still active, still playing their roles, still maintaining the illusion that everything is normal. But we're out here. The real ones who got away, the family members who figured it out, the investigators who dug too deep. We're building something, a network, a resistance, a way to fight back against people who think human beings are just biological hardware to be optimized. They called it Project Reflection, and I'm starting to understand why. It wasn't just about creating copies of people, it was about creating a world that reflected their vision of how humanity should behave. Compliant, predictable, controllable. But reflections are just images. They're not real, and the real world is about to fight back. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains, 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Dyatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Dyatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled the Evening Autoton, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Dyatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Dyatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day, and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Dyatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vizhai by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hiker's belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of salo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these 2 friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 metres away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Dyatlov was better dressed than the 2 under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Dyatlov, searchers found Zinaida Zina Kolmogorova, the 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 metres from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Dyatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolovatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these three had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The fourth person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All four of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The four in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manatee people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Dyatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Dyatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mazyak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Dyatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogoreva's mother, for instance, and Igor Dyatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Dyatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Dyatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Dyatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Dyatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Dyatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, signs. Hello, fellow seekers of the strange and unexplained. Before we begin tonight's journey into the shadows of history, I want to take a moment to connect with you, wherever you might be listening to this. How was your day today? I hope it treated you kindly. What time is it where you are right now? Are you settling in for the night, perhaps with the soft glow of a bedside lamp? Or maybe you're listening in the early morning hours when the world feels most mysterious. And where in this vast world are you tuning in from? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet rural town, know that you're part of our global community of truth seekers. If you're new to sleep theories, welcome to our family of night wanderers and mystery lovers. We explore the stories that linger in the shadows of official history, the cases that were buried, the witnesses who were silenced, and the truths that powerful people would prefer remained forgotten. If tonight's story resonates with you, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden truths to light, one whispered tale at a time. Now settle in, turn down the lights, let the outside world fade away. Tonight I'm sharing something that was never meant to be shared, a story passed down through blood and sworn to secrecy for over 50 years. This is the story of my Uncle Stefan, the man the world knew as the Falcon Lake Witness. But what the world doesn't know, what they were never allowed to know, changes everything. My name is Mark Krawczyk. This is my final testimony before I disappear forever. My uncle never drank again after Falcon Lake. Not because he found God, or discovered some new philosophy of clean living. Stefan Michalak stopped drinking because alcohol made the line between reality and nightmare too thin. And after what happened to him in those Manitoba woods on May 20th, 1967, he could never again afford to question what was real. Growing up in Winnipeg in the 1970s, I heard the whispers at family gatherings, hushed conversations that would stop the moment a child entered the room, references to the burned man in the woods and what really happened to Stefan. My parents, his sister and brother-in-law would exchange those loaded glances that adults think children don't notice. But I noticed everything. I was 15 when I first saw the documents. It was Christmas Eve, 1978. The adults were deep in their cups, all except Uncle Stefan, who sat quietly in his chair, nursing the same cup of coffee he'd been holding for hours. I'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom in his house, but curiosity led me to his study instead. The door was usually locked, but that night, perhaps loosened by the holiday spirit or simply forgotten in the chaos of family gathering, it stood slightly ajar. Inside, papers were scattered across his desk like autumn leaves. But these weren't ordinary documents. They had official letterheads, RCMP, Department of National Defense, something called Project Blue Book from the United States Air Force. I saw photocopied medical reports with burned flesh that made my stomach turn. Radiation readings that meant nothing to my teenage mind but somehow felt ominous. And sketches. God, those sketches! Detailed drawings of what looked like a submarine standing on end, with precise measurements and notes written in Stefan's careful handwriting. But it wasn't the craft itself that made my blood run cold. It was the figures he'd drawn beside it. Two humanoid shapes in what appeared to be protective suits, their faces obscured, but their posture somehow wrong, as if they were human, but not quite. Complete. "You shouldn't be in here, Mark." We spun around to find Stefan standing in the doorway, but instead of anger, his face held something much worse, a deep bone-weary sadness that seemed to age him decades in the dim light. "I'm sorry, Uncle, I was just curious," he finished, stepping into the room and quietly closing the door behind him. "That's good. Curiosity is what keeps us human." He moved to the desk and began gathering the papers with practiced efficiency. "But some curiosities can get you killed." He said it so matter-of-factly that it took a moment for the words to register. "What do you mean?" Stefan paused, a medical photograph halfway to a manila folder. In it I could see burn marks on human skin arranged in a perfect grid pattern, like someone had pressed a hot waffle iron against flesh. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? About your old uncle and his encounter with a flying saucer?" I nodded. "Most of it's true. The craft, the burns, the radiation, all documented, all verified by doctors and scientists and government officials who should know better." He finished gathering the papers and locked them in a metal filing cabinet. "But the part they never tell, the part they made sure never got out, that's what could get us both in trouble." "What part?" Stefan sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 61 years. "The part where I wasn't the only witness. The part where what I saw wasn't from another world." He met my eyes, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. The part where they've been watching our family ever since, making sure we never tell the whole truth. Before I could ask what he meant, we heard my mother calling from downstairs. "Stefan, Mark, come down for the toast." "We should go," he said, standing. But as we reached the door, he put a hand on my shoulder. "Mark, if something ever happens to me, if I have an accident or get sick suddenly or just disappear, there's a lockbox in my bedroom closet, behind the winter coats. The combination is your birthday, November 3rd, 1962. Inside you'll find everything they don't want you to know." "Uncle Stefan, you're scaring me." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Fear keeps you alive. Remember what I said about curiosity. It's what keeps us human. But fear is what keeps us breathing." That was the last meaningful conversation I ever had with my uncle. 3 months later he was dead, officially from a heart attack, though he'd never had heart problems before. The funeral was small, attended by family and a few friends, but I noticed the two men in dark suits standing at the back of the cemetery, Men who didn't approach the grave or speak to anyone. Men who watched everything with the cold professionalism of people who did this for a living. I was 18 when I finally opened that lockbox. May 20th, 1967. My uncle walked into the woods, a man of science. He came back scorched by something no science could explain. According to the official record, the one you can find in UFO books and declassified government files, Stefan Michalak was an amateur geologist and prospector who had gone to the Falcon Lake area, about 80 miles east of Winnipeg, looking for quartz and silver. He was alone, which wasn't unusual for him. Stefan preferred the solitude of the wilderness to the company of most people. What happened next became one of Canada's most documented UFO encounters. At approximately 12:15 p.m, Stefan noticed two glowing objects descending from the sky. One landed briefly on a large flat rock about 160 feet away, then took off again. The second craft, metallic, disc-shaped, about 35 feet in diameter, settled onto the rock and remained there. For the next 30 minutes, Stefan observed the craft through welding goggles he'd brought for his prospecting work. He could hear mechanical sounds coming from inside, voices speaking what sounded like a Slavic language, and he could see a brilliant purple light emanating from within. Two door-like openings were visible on the side facing him. Being a methodical man, Stefan sketched everything he saw. The craft's dimensions, the pattern of lights around its circumference, the appearance of the two openings. He noted the time, the weather conditions, even the smell in the air, which he described as sulphur mixed with hot metal. This is where the official story gets interesting, and where Stefan's personal account, the one he shared with investigators but never with the press, becomes genuinely terrifying. Stefan claimed he called out first in English, then in several European languages, thinking he might be observing some kind of experimental aircraft. When he received no response, his scientific curiosity overcame his caution. He approached the craft. "I thought it might be Americans," he told the RCMP investigators, according to the transcripts I found in his lockbox. "Some kind of military test. I wanted to help if someone was in trouble." As he got closer, Stefan could see the interior of the craft through the open panels. Banks of lights in colours he'd never seen before, surfaces that seemed to bend light around them, and something else. Movement. Figures in what appeared to be protective suits moving purposefully around what looked like control panels. Stefan got within 30 feet of the craft when one of the panels suddenly slammed shut. He raised his hand and called out again, trying to indicate he was friendly. That's when he saw them clearly for the first time. Two figures appeared at the remaining opening. They were humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving in a way that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with terrestrial gravity. They wore what Stefan described as lead-lined suits that completely obscured their features, but he could see their eyes through faceplates that seemed to glow with their own internal light. The figures observed Stefan for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then one of them raised what might have been a hand, and Stefan felt a wave of something. Not heat, not sound, but a pressure that seemed to push against his thoughts themselves. "It was like they were reading me," Stefan told investigators, looking through me to see if I was a threat. Apparently they decided he was. The remaining panel began to close, but as it did, Stefan made a crucial mistake. He reached out and touched the craft's hull. The surface was smooth, almost frictionless, and warm. For just a moment, Stefan felt connected to something vast and ancient, a consciousness that spanned star systems and dealt in time frames that made human history seem like a single heartbeat. Then the craft expelled him. A grid of superheated air struck Stefan's chest and abdomen, burning through his shirt and undershirt to sear a waffle iron pattern into his flesh. The force threw him backward 15 feet, where he landed hard against a fallen tree. By the time he recovered enough to look up, the craft was rising silently into the sky, disappearing into the afternoon sun. Stefan managed to make it back to his car and drive himself to the nearest hospital in Kenora, Ontario. The medical staff was baffled by his burns. They showed clear signs of radiation exposure, but there was no identifiable source. The pattern was too regular to be accidental, too precise to be natural. Within 48 hours, investigators from the RCMP, the Department of National Defense, and the United States Air Force had converged on Falcon Lake. They found radioactive material at the site, metal fragments that didn't match any known alloy, soil samples that showed elevated radiation levels in a perfect circle 20 feet in diameter, and vegetation that had been killed in patterns that suggested exposure to focused microwave energy. Stefan was interviewed, re-interviewed, polygraphed, hypnotized, and subjected to every test they could devise. His story never changed. The evidence supported his claims. The radiation was real, the burns were real, the physical traces at the site were real. But the figures he described, the ones in the protective suits, those details were quietly removed from the official reports. National security, the investigators told him. Some details are better left classified. Stefan agreed to keep quiet about what he'd really seen inside the craft. It seemed like a reasonable request at the time. He had no way of knowing that his compliance had just painted a target on his back that would follow him for the rest of his life, or that the figures in the suits weren't from another world at all. He wasn't the only one to see it. He was just the one who lived. The cassette tapes in Stefan's lockbox contained recordings he'd made in the weeks following the incident. His voice, thin and exhausted, describing details he'd never shared with the official investigators. May 15th, 5 days before my encounter, spoke with Thomas Beargrease, one of the Ojibwe hunters who worked the area around Falcon Lake. He's been seeing lights for weeks. Not just lights. Structured craft, moving in formation, always at night. Says the animals are scared. Deer won't come into the area anymore. Fish are gone from the lake. Even the insects have stopped singing. I listened to these tapes alone in my apartment at 2 a.m, the same age Stefan had been when he walked into those woods. The quality was poor, filled with static that might have been electromagnetic interference, but his words were clear enough. Thomas says his grandfather told stories about the Star People who came down to test the courage of warriors. But these aren't the Star People from the old stories. These are something else, something that doesn't belong here but has been here for a long time. According to Stefan's private notes, the military response to his encounter had been too fast, too organised. Teams of specialists arrived at Falcon Lake within 72 hours, equipped with radiation detection equipment, soil analysis kits, and metal detectors. They sectioned off the area and began what they called atmospheric radiation testing. A convenient cover story that kept civilians away while they collected evidence, but some of that evidence had been planted. June 8th, 1967, returned to the site against orders. Found metal fragments that weren't there before, arranged in a pattern that looks almost decorative. Someone wants this to look like an alien crash site. But why stage evidence for something that really happened? The answer was in a manila envelope hidden between the pages of a geology textbook. Photocopied documents that Stefan had somehow obtained from an inside source. The letterhead read, Project Gabriel, Atmospheric Radiation Effects on Human Subjects, with classification markings that made my hands shake as I held them. Project Gabriel was real. Declassified documents confirm it was a Cold War-era study on nuclear fallout and its effects on human biology. But according to Stefan's stolen files, Gabriel had expanded far beyond simple radiation research. By 1967, they were testing advanced energy weapons, psychological warfare techniques, and something called controlled contact scenarios. The files contained test subjects' names, dates, locations, and results. Most of the names were blacked out, but I could read enough to understand what I was looking at. Field tests of exotic weapons on unwilling human subjects, often disguised as UFO encounters to discredit witnesses and maintain plausible deniability. Stefan's name was on the list. Subject demonstrates ideal psychological profile for contact scenario 7, read his evaluation. Isolated, scientifically minded, credible witness potential. Recommend full exposure with modified craft. Radiation levels to be kept sublethal but sufficient for long-term monitoring opportunity. They hadn't been studying aliens. They'd been studying how far they could push a man, psychologically, physically, spiritually, before he stopped being one. The craft Stefan encountered wasn't from another world. It was a prototype vehicle developed from recovered technology, piloted by military personnel in environmental suits designed to obscure their human appearance. The radiation exposure wasn't accidental. It was a tracking device, a way to monitor Stefan's location and health for the rest of his life. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten note in Stefan's careful script, dated just 3 weeks before his death. "They're not done with me. The burns faded years ago, but something else is growing. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. The radiation wasn't just for tracking, it was a timer, and my time is almost up." Below that, in different ink, as if added later, "They're watching the whole family now, especially Mark. His curiosity makes him dangerous. I should have kept him away from the truth, but it's too late now. If something happens to me, he's the only one who can finish this." I set the tapes aside and reached for the final item in Stefan's lockbox, a Polaroid photograph that made my blood turn to ice water. It was a surveillance photo, taken with a telephoto lens, showing me as a teenager standing in Stefan's study on that Christmas Eve night in 1978. I was holding one of his classified documents, clearly visible in the shot. At the bottom, someone had written in block letters, "Subject acquired. Maintain surveillance. Await further orders." They'd been watching me for over a decade, and they knew I had the files. The conspiracy went deeper than even Stefan suspected. Hidden among his geological surveys and mineral maps, I found a manila folder labelled Research Notes. Do not open until after my death. Inside were photocopy pages from what appeared to be a military manual stamped with classification so high I'd never seen their like. Gabriel Protocol, Field Manual for Exotic Weapons Testing. Chapter 12, Controlled Contact Scenarios. Section 4, Post-Contact Subject Management. The manual read like science fiction, but the dates, locations and personnel involved were all too real. Project Gabriel hadn't been just about nuclear fallout. It had evolved into something far more sinister. According to the documents, by the mid-1960s, the US military had recovered several craft of unknown origin from crash sites around the world. Rather than studying them in secret, a decision was made to reverse engineer the technology and test it on American and Canadian civilians as part of psychological warfare research. The goal wasn't to create flying saucers, it was to create the perfect cover story for weapons testing that would otherwise be considered war crimes. UFO encounters provide ideal cover for exotic weapons trials, read one memo dated March 15th, 1967, just 2 months before Stefan's encounter. Witnesses become unreliable due to social stigma. Media dismisses claims as fantasy. Government maintains plausible deniability while gathering crucial performance data. The Falcon Lake incident had been a field test of something called a focused microwave array, a weapon designed to deliver precise doses of radiation to human targets. Stefan's burns weren't accidental damage from an alien propulsion system. They were the intended result of a successful weapons test. But Stefan's case file contained details that chilled me to the bone. Subject responded exactly as predicted to Scenario 7, benevolent contact with hostile termination. Radiation exposure achieved optimal levels for long-term biological monitoring. Subject's credibility and scientific background make him ideal witness for cover story propagation. Recommend continued surveillance with periodic incidents to maintain psychological pressure. They'd been torturing him for years. Every strange phone call, every period of electronic interference, every mysterious illness. It had all been carefully orchestrated to keep Stefan isolated and afraid. And they documented it all with the cold precision of researchers studying lab rats. The final page in the folder was a personnel roster for Gabriel Team 7, Falcon Lake Operation. Most of the names were blacked out, but 2 were still visible. Dr. Marcus Webb, Ph.D., Psychological Operations Specialist Colonel James Hartwell, Exotic Weapons Testing Division. Below that, in Stefan's handwriting, Webb visited me at the hospital, said he was from the university, researching trauma responses, asked too many questions about what I saw inside the craft, took notes on everything I said. I thought he was trying to help me understand what happened. Now I know he was evaluating the success of their experiment. Stefan had been manipulated from the very beginning. His testimony, his medical records, even his decision to keep certain details classified. It had all been guided by his handlers, ensuring that the official story served their purposes while hiding the true nature of their crimes. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Tucked between the pages of the manual was a single sheet of paper, a medical report dated just 6 months before Stefan's death. The letterhead read, Gabriel Biological Monitoring Station, Subject 67 FL-001, Michalak Stefan. The report detailed the progression of what they called controlled cellular degradation, the long-term effects of the radiation exposure from his encounter. They'd been tracking the cancer growing in his body with the same methodical precision they used to plan their weapons tests. They knew he was dying. They'd designed it that way. And at the bottom of the report, a notation that made my hands shake. Subject's nephew, Mark Krochik, DOB 11-3062, shows identical psychological profile to primary subject. Recommend recruitment for Phase 2 testing upon subject termination. Phase 2 testing. They weren't done with our family. Stefan's death wasn't the end of their experiment. It was graduation to the next level, and I was the next test subject. That's when I noticed the cars. Black sedans parked at the end of my street. Different ones each day, but always there. Men in unremarkable suits who seemed to be reading newspapers but never turned the pages. Phone calls where no one spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. The surveillance was part of the psychological conditioning, designed to make me paranoid, isolated, easier to manipulate when they were ready to make their move. But Stefan had prepared for this possibility. Hidden in the back of his final journal, I found an address written in code, a cabin in the Manitoba wilderness, stocked with supplies and equipped with radio equipment that operated on frequencies the government didn't monitor. And a final message. If you're reading this, then they've started Phase 2. The cabin is your sanctuary, but only temporarily. They'll find it eventually, they always do. Use the time to prepare. The truth must survive, even if we don't. Over 40 people vanished from the area between 1966 and 1969. But you won't find that in the papers. Stefan's research had uncovered a pattern that the authorities either missed or chose to ignore. In the 3 years surrounding the Falcon Lake incident, dozens of people had disappeared from the wilderness areas of southeastern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. Hunters, hikers, prospectors, fishermen, people who knew the woods and wouldn't get lost under normal circumstances. The disappearances followed a geographic pattern, forming a rough circle with Falcon Lake at its centre. Each vanishing occurred during periods of unusual atmospheric activity. Strange lights, electromagnetic disturbances, reports of low-frequency humming that could be felt more than heard. I found a detailed map in Stefan's files, marked with red X's for each disappearance, and black dots for what he called secondary encounters. People who returned from the area with missing time, unexplained injuries, or psychological trauma they couldn't fully describe. The secondary encounters told a story that made my blood run cold. James McLeod, age 34, hunting guide. Returned from a 3-day trip with no memory of the final 18 hours. Found by search parties sitting by a cold campfire staring at the sky. Medical examination revealed elevated radiation levels and burn marks on his palms consistent with electrical contact. Sarah Chen, age 28, botanical researcher. Discovered unconscious near Falcon Lake with precise surgical incisions behind both ears. No memory of how she got there, or who might have performed the procedures. Scars healed with unusual speed, leaving behind tissue that pathologists described as inconsistent with normal human cellular structure. Thomas Beargrease, the Ojibwe hunter Stefan had spoken with, was found dead in his cabin 3 months after the Falcon Lake incident. Official cause of death was heart failure, but the coroner's notes mentioned anomalous brain activity and evidence of exposure to unknown electromagnetic fields. Each case file contained similar details: missing time, medical anomalies, and psychological trauma that left the survivors unable to function normally in society. Many ended up in psychiatric institutions. Others simply disappeared again, walking back into the wilderness and never returning. But the most disturbing discovery was a carbon copy of a letter Stefan had sent to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1970, 3 years after his encounter. I have reason to believe the disappearances in the Falcon Lake area are connected to classified military operations. During my own encounter, I observed personnel in protective suits who appeared to be conducting experiments on local wildlife. I have since learned that several of the missing persons were last seen in areas where I later found evidence of weapons testing. Scorched earth, metal fragments, and radiation signatures consistent with advanced energy weapons. The response came from Inspector David Morrison of the RCMP Criminal Investigation Division. Mr. Michalak, while we appreciate your continued cooperation in the investigation of your 1967 incident, we must advise you that speculation about military connections to unrelated missing persons cases is not helpful to our efforts. We recommend you focus on your recovery and leave criminal investigations to qualified professionals. Below the official response, Stefan had written in pen, Morrison was at the site 2 days after my encounter. He knew exactly what they were testing and who was behind it. This isn't incompetence, it's a cover-up. The files contained one more piece of evidence that transformed my understanding of the entire conspiracy. A reel-to-reel tape recording made by a retired park ranger named Bill Henderson in the summer of 1968. Henderson had worked the Falcon Lake area for over 20 years. He'd seen Stefan's encounter from a distance, though he'd never come forward publicly. His voice on the tape was gravelly with age and fear. I was doing my evening rounds checking the campsites when I heard that sound again, like a generator running underwater but coming from the sky. I looked up and saw 3 of them, the same kind of craft Stefan described but smaller. They were hovering over the lake in formation, maybe 50 feet above the water. That's when I saw the boats. Military Zodiac rafts, 6 or 7 of them, all painted black. Men in full environmental suits were pulling something out of the water, something big, something that moved like it was alive. They loaded it onto one of the craft and the whole formation took off toward the south. I watched through binoculars until they disappeared. Then I went down to the lake to see what they'd been doing. The water was warm, almost hot, and there were dead fish floating everywhere. But not just dead, cooked, like they'd been boiled from the inside. I reported it to my supervisor the next morning. He told me I'd been working too hard, that I should take some time off. When I came back 2 weeks later, my supervisor was gone. New man in charge, someone I'd never seen before. He told me there'd been a training exercise in the area, nothing to worry about, and if anyone asked, I was to refer them to the Department of National Defense. I kept my mouth shut for 30 years, but Stefan was right. This wasn't about aliens. This was about testing weapons on our own people, using the UFO story to cover it up. And anyone who got too close to the truth, well, you can see what happened to Stefan. Henderson's tape was dated August 15th, 1998. According to the obituary I found tucked behind the reel, he died 3 days later from what was described as sudden cardiac arrest. The pattern was clear, and it was accelerating. They were cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might have knowledge of the true nature of the Falcon Lake incident. And based on the surveillance I'd noticed around my apartment, I was next on their list. That's when I made the decision to disappear. The scars faded, but something else took hold. Stefan's cabin was exactly where his coded directions said it would be, hidden in a grove of white birch trees 40 miles north of Falcon Lake, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that hadn't seen vehicle traffic in years. The building itself was small but well constructed, with solar panels for power and a hand pump well for water. Inside, I found everything Stefan had promised. Preserved food, medical supplies, and a sophisticated radio setup that could monitor military and emergency frequencies across North America. But more importantly, I found his final research. Documents and recordings he'd hidden even from the lockbox in his bedroom. The truth was worse than I'd imagined. Stefan's journal entries from the months before his death revealed that his encounter at Falcon Lake had been just the beginning. The radiation exposure had done more than mark him for surveillance. It had changed him on a fundamental level. altering his brain chemistry in ways that made him sensitive to electromagnetic fields and able to perceive things beyond normal human sensory range. February 12th, 1981. The dreams are getting stronger. I can see them working, moving through their underground facilities like ants in a colony. They're not all human anymore. Some of them volunteered for the same kind of changes they forced on me, but in a controlled way, enhanced, improved. They think they're becoming something better than human, but they're really becoming something less. The dream Stefan described matched exactly what I'd been experiencing since opening his lockbox. Visions of metallic corridors filled with figures in environmental suits, laboratories where human subjects were exposed to radiations that rewrote their genetic code, and vast underground complexes that stretched beneath the Canadian wilderness like veins in a diseased body. But it wasn't until I found the photographs that I understood why Stefan had been so afraid. Hidden in a lead-lined box beneath the cabin's floorboards were dozens of surveillance photos showing Stefan throughout his life. Not taken by government agents, but somehow captured from impossible angles, as if the cameras had been floating in mid-air. The images showed him at work, at home, even sleeping in his own bed. The final photograph in the series showed Stefan on the day before his death, standing in his backyard and looking directly at the camera with an expression of resigned acceptance. But he wasn't looking at a surveillance team or a hidden photographer. He was looking up at the sky, at something the camera couldn't capture but that had clearly terrified him. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Subject termination authorized. Proceed with Phase 2 recruitment." That's when I realised they weren't watching me from cars parked on the street or through telephoto lenses. They were watching me the same way they'd watched Stefan, from above, using technology that shouldn't exist but clearly did. The radio equipment in the cabin began picking up transmissions 3 days after I arrived. Military frequencies carrying coded messages about asset recovery and northern operations. Most of it was routine, but one transmission made my hands shake as I transcribed it. Control, this is Eagle Eye 7. Target has relocated to grid reference Charlie 47. Recommend immediate extraction before subject accesses final documentation. Final documentation. There was something else Stefan had hidden. Something so important that they were willing to risk exposure to prevent me from finding it. I began searching the cabin systematically, checking every hiding place I could imagine. Behind loose floorboards, inside the walls, even in the septic tank, nothing. But Stefan had been a geologist, trained to think in 3 dimensions, and finally I thought to look up. In the attic, wrapped in plastic and tucked into the space between roof joists, I found a metal cylinder about the size of a coffee can. Inside were documents that made everything else seem trivial by comparison. They weren't from Project Gabriel. They were older, much older, with letterheads from something called Operation Majestic, a program that apparently predated Gabriel by 20 years. The papers detailed the recovery of crashed non-human vehicles beginning in 1947, not from Roswell, but from sites across Canada that had been kept classified at the highest levels of government. The technology recovered from these crashes had been reverse-engineered and weaponized, then tested on unwitting civilians to evaluate both its effectiveness and its psychological impact. But the most shocking revelation was the source of the original crashes. According to the Majestic files, the vehicles hadn't been extraterrestrial at all. They were time-displaced human technology, artifacts from our own future, somehow thrown back through temporal distortions created by atomic weapons testing. The beings recovered from the crashes were human, but changed by centuries of genetic manipulation and technological integration. We weren't being visited by aliens, we were being visited by ourselves. The Falcon Lake incident had been a test of time displacement technology, an attempt to create a stable temporal corridor that would allow information and personnel to move freely between past and future. Stefan's exposure to the exotic radiation had made him a living anchor point, a way for the future humans to monitor and influence events in the past. And now they wanted me to serve the same function. The final document in the cylinder was a personal message from Stefan, dated just hours before his death. "Mark, If you're reading this, then the temporal displacement is accelerating. They've succeeded in creating a stable corridor, and they're using it to reshape history according to their needs. The cancer they gave me wasn't just to track my location, it was to test biological compatibility with their technology. They need genetic material from people who've been exposed to their temporal radiation, and they need it while we're still alive. I won't let them have it. By the time you read this, I'll have made sure my death was natural, not induced. But you're different. Younger, stronger, more resistant to their influence. You might be able to break the cycle. The cabin has been shielded with materials that disrupt their surveillance technology, but it won't hold them forever. Use the time you have to prepare, document everything, make copies, hide them where they'll be found by people who can act on the information. And whatever you do, don't let them take you alive. What they want to do to you, what they did to me, it's worse than death. It's erasure from history itself. That night, I began experiencing the dream Stefan had described. Visions of underground laboratories where human subjects were being transformed into something that barely qualified as alive. But unlike Stephen's dreams, mine came with a growing certainty that they weren't glimpses of the future. They were memories from the past, bleeding back through the temporal distortions that the time-displaced humans had created. I was remembering my own future, and it was a nightmare beyond description. If this reaches you, then either I'm wrong, or I've been found. It's been 6 months since I discovered Stefan's final documents, and the dreams have become constant now. Not sleeping dreams, but waking visions that overlay reality like a double-exposed photograph. I see the world as it is, but also as it will become. Empty cities overgrown with vegetation, skies filled with craft that move like living things, and humanity transformed into something that serves the temporal manipulators without question or resistance. The worst part is understanding that this future isn't inevitable, it's already happened, and we're living in the echoes of that transformed timeline. Every UFO sighting, every government cover-up, every person who disappears into the wilderness around Falcon Lake is part of a process that was completed centuries ago from the perspective of the time-displaced humans. We're not experiencing an invasion, we're experiencing an excavation, a systematic harvesting of genetic material and consciousness from key individuals throughout history, all to support a timeline where humanity's future is already written. The surveillance around the cabin has intensified. I can see them now without binoculars, figures in environmental suits moving through the trees at night, always staying just at the edge of vision. They're not trying to capture me yet. They're studying me, documenting the progression of the temporal sensitivity that Stefan experienced, waiting for the optimal moment to complete their harvest. But I've learned something they don't know I know. The radio equipment in the cabin has been modified with components Stefan salvaged from the Falcon Lake site, fragments of the original craft that somehow retain their temporal properties. When configured correctly, these fragments allow communication not just across space but across time. I've been receiving messages from other versions of myself, other timelines where I made different choices. In one timeline, I surrendered to the time-displaced humans and became part of their collective consciousness. The version of me from that reality has been trying to warn me, sending fragmented messages through the quantum static. Don't trust the dreams. They're not visions of the future. They're programming. They're preparing your mind for integration. Resist the call to Falcon Lake. That's where the main temporal anchor is located. That's where they'll complete the process. But in another timeline, I fought back. That version of myself discovered how to disrupt their temporal manipulation technology using the same exotic radiation that marked Stefan for surveillance. The process requires returning to the original site and overloading the quantum field generators they've hidden beneath the lake. It's a suicide mission. The radiation exposure would be massive, far beyond what Stefan experienced, but it might be enough to collapse their temporal corridor and strand them in their own time, cutting off their ability to manipulate the past. I've been preparing for 3 days now. Stefan's cabin contained more than just documents. Hidden in a lead-lined vault beneath the radio equipment, I found a device he'd constructed from salvaged craft components. It looks like a backpack-mounted generator, but according to his notes, it's actually a temporal disruptor capable of creating localized time distortions. The device is untested. Stefan died before he could use it, but his calculations suggest it might be powerful enough to disrupt the quantum fields, maintaining the time-displaced humans' anchor point at Falcon Lake. If I'm successful, the temporal corridor will collapse. The future timeline where humanity becomes enslaved to these transformed beings might never come to pass. But the energy release will almost certainly kill me, and there's no guarantee that disrupting one anchor point will be enough to stop their entire operation. I'm leaving this recording because someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand what really happened at Falcon Lake, and what's still happening to people who get too close to the truth. The Falcon Lake incident was never about aliens from another world. It was about humans from another time, our own descendants, transformed by centuries of genetic manipulation and technological integration, harvesting the past to ensure their own twisted evolution continues. Stefan Michalak wasn't the victim of an alien encounter. He was the victim of temporal warfare, marked for surveillance and eventual harvesting by creatures that had once been human, but had given up everything that made them truly alive. And I'm the next generation of their experiment, the son of a timeline they've been reshaping for decades, bred and conditioned to serve as an anchor point for their continued manipulation of history. But I refuse to play my assigned role. Tomorrow morning I'm returning to Falcon Lake. I'm going to activate Stefan's temporal disruptor and overload their quantum field generators. If the calculations are correct, the resulting explosion will create a paradox that severs their connection to our timeline permanently. If I'm wrong, well, then you'll never hear this recording, because they'll have succeeded in rewriting history to prevent it from ever being made. I'm hiding copies of Stefan's documents in locations around the lake, places where they'll eventually be found by researchers, journalists, or government investigators who might be able to act on the information. The truth needs to survive, even if we don't. The most important thing to remember is that the time-displaced humans are vulnerable to their own technology. The temporal radiation that allows them to manipulate the past also makes them dependent on quantum field generators to maintain their existence in our timeline. Disrupt those generators, and they'll be pulled back to their own time like a rubber band snapping. I can hear them moving through the trees now. They know I've discovered their weakness, and they're closing in. But they're too late. The disruptor is armed, the documents are hidden, and I'm already walking toward the lake. If you're listening to this, then some version of the plan worked. The truth survived, even if I didn't. Use it wisely. Use it to stop them before they can complete their harvest of human consciousness. And remember, the next time you see strange lights in the sky or hear stories about UFO encounters, ask yourself, are you witnessing visitors from another world? Or are you seeing the shadow of humanity's own twisted future, reaching back through time to ensure its own creation? The answer might determine whether our species has any future at all. This is Mark Krochik, nephew of Stefan Michalak, recording what may be my final message. The date is October 31st, 2024. The time is 3:47 a.m. I'm standing at the edge of Falcon Lake and I can see lights beneath the water. The glow of the quantum field generators that have been hidden here for over 50 years. The temporal disruptor is activated. The energy readings are off the charts. In about 60 seconds, either this timeline will be freed from their manipulation, or it will be erased entirely. Either way, the experiment ends here. The water is getting brighter. I can feel the radiation building, the same burning sensation Stefan described, but magnified 1,000 times. The figures in environmental suits are emerging from the forest, moving toward me with desperate urgency. They know what I'm about to do, but they're too late. 30 seconds now. The device is beyond the point of no return. The quantum fields are destabilizing, and I can feel reality itself beginning to bend around me. Time is moving in loops, showing me fragments of possible futures, some where humanity remains free, others where we become the very monsters I'm trying to stop. 15 seconds. The lake is boiling now, steam rising in patterns that shouldn't be possible. The time-displaced humans are screaming, a sound that exists outside normal hearing, transmitted directly into my consciousness. They're being pulled back to their own time, their anchor point in our reality dissolving. 10 seconds. The burning is unbearable now, but I can see through the pain to something beyond. A timeline where Stefan lived a normal life. where people don't disappear in the wilderness, where the sky belongs to birds instead of temporal predators. 5 seconds. If anyone finds this recording, remember that the truth is worth any sacrifice. Remember that some choices echo across centuries, and that sometimes the only way to save the future is to Welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to connect with you, wherever you are in this world. How was your day? What time is it where you're listening? Are you settling in for the night in New York, catching this during your morning commute in London, or perhaps listening while the sun sets in California? Whatever brought you here tonight, thank you for joining us. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that haunt our recent history, please subscribe to Sleep Theories. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories they'd rather you forget. Now let me tell you about my friend Terry, Officer Terence Yeakey, and let me tell you why, 28 years later, I still check my rearview mirror twice before I park. The morning of April 19th, 1995 started like any other Wednesday in Oklahoma City. I was working dispatch when the call came in at 9:02 a.m. At first, we thought it was a gas explosion, maybe a boiler malfunction at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The initial reports were confused, fragmented. Someone screaming about a collapsed building. Children crying. The word bomb hadn't even entered our vocabulary yet. Terry was 3 blocks away when it happened. Officer Terence Yeakey, Oklahoma City Police Department, badge number 573. He was the kind of cop who still believed the badge meant something, still believed we were the good guys. He was the first one inside the rubble, and maybe that's where his life ended, even if he didn't know it yet. I didn't see Terry until that evening. When he finally made it back to the station, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in 8 hours. His uniform was covered in concrete dust and blood, some his own, most belonging to the people he'd pulled from the wreckage. His hands were cut to hell from digging through twisted metal and broken glass, but his eyes were different, haunted in a way I'd never seen before. "How many?" I asked him as he sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. 4 confirmed saves, he said quietly. Maybe more. Hard to tell in all that chaos. The news was already calling him a hero. Officer Yeakey, first responder, saviour of innocence. They'd interview him the next day, and he'd give them the standard lines about doing his duty, about how anyone would have done the same. But that night, sitting in our nearly empty station house, he wasn't thinking about heroism. "Something's not right about this whole thing," he said, staring at his bandaged hands. "What do you mean?" Terry looked around the room, even though we were practically alone. How fast they got there. The feds, I mean. A TF, FBI, agents I didn't recognise. They were suiting up and organising before our backup even arrived. Maybe they were in the area. Maybe. But the way he said it told me he didn't believe that for a second. That was the beginning. The first crack in Terry's faith in the system he'd sworn to serve. Over the next few days, as the official story began to take shape, domestic terrorist Timothy McVeigh, lone wolf, fertilizer bomb in a rental truck. Terry started asking questions that made people uncomfortable. He'd always been thorough, is what made him a good cop. But after the bombing, his thoroughness became something else, an obsession. He started keeping a journal, writing down everything he remembered from that morning. Every detail, no matter how small. The position of vehicles, the timing of arrivals, the faces of agents who seemed to know exactly where to go in a building that had just been destroyed. "I'm going to figure this out," he told me about a week after the bombing. "Something happened in that building that they don't want us to know about. Terry, maybe you should talk to someone, a counsellor. What you saw in there..." "This isn't PTSD," he cut me off. "This is about the truth." He rented a safety deposit box at a bank across town, started making copies of everything, his incident reports, photographs he'd taken with his personal camera, witness statements that didn't make it into the official record. He became paranoid about his regular locker at the station, convinced someone was going through his things. "They're watching me," he told his ex-wife Tonya during one of their phone calls about their kids. She'd tell me about it later, after everything happened, how Terry's voice had changed, how he'd started checking his car for tracking devices. The Heroes Medal ceremony was scheduled for May 1996. The mayor wanted to present it personally. Local news would be there. It should have been the highlight of Terry's career. Instead, he spent those weeks talking about federal agents who arrived too quickly, about surveillance footage that disappeared, about explosive residue patterns that didn't match the official story. He said he didn't trust anyone anymore, Tonya would tell me years later. He didn't even trust me by the end. By the fall of 1995, Terry had changed. The easy smile was gone. He'd lost weight, started working double shifts, claiming he needed the overtime, but I knew he was avoiding going home to an empty apartment where he'd lie awake replaying that morning over and over. He'd developed a routine. Every Friday after a shift, he'd drive to that bank across town and spend an hour in the safety deposit box room, adding pages to his growing file. Sometimes he'd come back to the station afterward looking grim. "Find something interesting?" I asked one evening. "You ever notice how fast the ATF response team got to the scene?" Terry asked instead of answering. "They're trained for this kind of thing." "They're trained, sure, but they're not psychic." Terry pulled out a small notebook, not his official one, but a personal journal he'd started keeping. According to radio logs, first ATF agents were on scene at 9:17 a.m, 15 minutes after the blast. So, their offices are in Dallas. It's a 3.5-hour drive to Oklahoma City. How'd they get there so fast? I thought about it. Maybe they were already in town. For what? There was no ATF operation in Oklahoma City that morning. I checked. His voice dropped. Unless there was one they didn't want us to know about. That's when Terry started talking about what he'd seen inside the building. Not the heroic rescue parts that made it into the news reports, but the other things, the inconsistencies. "I found a man on the 3rd floor," he told me one night, crushed under debris, probably dead for an hour, but his watch had stopped at 9:04. "Watches break in explosions, Terry." "Sure, but his body was warm, fresh blood, like he'd been injured after the blast, not during it." Terry's paranoia was becoming infectious. I started noticing things too. How certain federal agents seemed to know exactly where to look in the wreckage, how quickly they cordoned off sections of the building, how witness statements were being revised to match the official timeline. But it was the photographs that really convinced me Terry was onto something. He'd brought his personal camera to the scene, against regulations, but in the chaos, nobody noticed. The pictures he took in those first crucial hours showed things that didn't make it into the FBI's evidence collection. "Look at this," he said, spreading the photos across his kitchen table. "See that van parked behind the building?" I looked. There was indeed a white van, positioned oddly close to the rear of the federal building. "Now look at this photo, taken 30 minutes later." The van was gone. "Could have been moved by emergency crews." "Could have been, but look at the license plate in the first photo." I squinted. The plate was partially visible but readable. "Did you run it?" "I tried. Came back as classified. Government vehicle." Terry had dozens of these photographs. Vehicles that appeared and disappeared. People in federal jackets who seemed to be directing operations before any official command structure was established. Areas of the building that were sealed off immediately before proper forensic teams arrived. They knew, Terry said quietly. Somehow, they knew this was going to happen. The next week, Terry's apartment was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. His TV, stereo, cash were all untouched. But his home office had been carefully searched. Papers shuffled through, computer files accessed. Professional job, Terry told me. Whoever did this knew what they were looking for. That's when he started varying his routes to work, started using payphones instead of his home line, started making copies of copies and storing them in multiple locations. I'm not crazy, he insisted. Someone doesn't want me asking these questions. His ex-wife Tonya started getting strange phone calls, hang-ups, voices asking about Terry's whereabouts. She began limiting the kids' visits to his apartment. He told me he had evidence that would blow the case wide open, she'd tell investigators later. Said he was going to take it to someone at the Department of Justice who could be trusted. By Christmas 1995, Terry was talking about federal agents inside the building before the explosion. Not arriving after, inside, already there, like they'd been waiting. I saw 3 men in ATF jackets on the second floor, he told me. They were taking photographs of something. This was maybe 10 minutes after the blast. But here's the thing, the stairwell they came down from was completely blocked by debris. Had been since the explosion. So how'd they get up there? I didn't have an answer for that. There's another way into that building, Terry continued. Has to be, and they knew about it. January 1996. That's when I started noticing my own phone acting strange. Clicks and delays. Conversations that felt like they had extra ears listening. I'd always dismissed Terry's paranoia as trauma-induced hypervigilance, but suddenly I wasn't so sure. The breaking point came when I tried to access security footage from police headquarters. Routine request. I was working on an unrelated case and needed to review some tape from the week of the bombing. The footage wasn't there. Not erased, not corrupted. Gone. Like it had never existed. Maintenance issue, the tech told me. System crashed that whole week. We lost everything. But I'd seen that footage myself right after the bombing. Watched Terry coming and going, noted the federal agents who'd visited our station. Now it was all gone. Terry wasn't surprised when I told him. They're cleaning house, he said, getting rid of anything that doesn't fit their story. That's when he showed me the real evidence, the stuff he'd been keeping in his safety deposit box. Copies of witness statements that had been revised by federal agents. Photographs of explosive residue patterns that didn't match a single truck bomb. Audio recordings of radio transmissions that were missing from official logs. Look at this, Terry said, pointing to a photograph of the building's interior. See that support column? According to the FBI, the truck bomb outside should have caused the progressive collapse we saw. But look at the blast pattern. I looked. The column showed signs of damage from the inside out, not outside in. That's not from a truck bomb in the street, Terry continued. That's from charges placed inside the building. Jesus, Terry, you're talking about... I'm talking about a coordinated attack using Timothy McVeigh as a patsy. Someone wanted that building to come down and they wanted it to look like domestic terrorism. The recordings were even more damning. Radio chatter from that morning that captured federal agents coordinating movements inside the building, while local responders were still trying to establish a perimeter outside. Agent Rodriguez, 3rd floor is clear for sweep. Copy that. Package is secure. Moving to extraction point Alpha. Package? I asked. That's what I want to know, Terry said. What package? And why were they extracting it while people were still trapped in the rubble? By February, Terry was talking about taking his evidence to the Department of Justice. He'd made contact with someone, he wouldn't tell me who worked in internal affairs. Someone who could be trusted to investigate without alerting the wrong people. I'm going to Washington next month, he told me. Going to hand-deliver everything. That's when the real harassment started. Terry's car was vandalised 3 times in 2 weeks. His apartment building's fire alarm went off at 3 a.m. every night for a week. Maintenance could never find the problem. He started getting followed by cars with government plates. They want me to know they're watching, he said. Want me to get scared and back off. But Terry wasn't backing off. If anything, the intimidation made him more determined. I pulled 4 people out of that building, he told me. 4 lives. I held a little girl while she died because the ceiling came down on her before I could get her out. If there's a chance that her death was part of some government operation, I owe it to her to find out. The medal ceremony was rescheduled for May 8, 1996. The mayor's office wanted to coordinate with national media. Terry's story had gained attention, and they wanted to capitalise on the positive publicity. Terry told them he wasn't sure he could attend. Bad timing, he said when they pressed him. I might be travelling. On May 6th, Terry called in sick to work. Said he had the flu, but his neighbour saw him leaving his apartment that morning carrying a large envelope and a small suitcase. He looked nervous, the neighbour would tell police later. Kept checking over his shoulder. That was the last time anyone saw Terence Yeakey alive. May 8th, 1996. The day Terry was supposed to receive his medal for heroism. Instead, his body was found in a field outside El Reno, 40 miles west of Oklahoma City. I got the call at 6 a.m. Captain Morrison's voice was flat, professional. "We found Yeakey. You need to get down here." The scene was wrong from the moment I arrived. Terry's car was parked on a dirt road, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. But his body was more than a mile away, across rough terrain dotted with barbed wire and thick brush. The official cause of death was suicide, but I've seen suicides. This wasn't one. Terry's wrist had been slashed, deep cuts that went to the bone. His arms were lacerated with dozens of smaller wounds. There were ligature marks around his neck, like he'd been strangled or hanged. And finally, a single gunshot wound to the head. "Hell of a way to kill yourself," the coroner muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The investigator in charge was FBI agent Sarah Chen. I'd never seen her before the bombing, but she'd been assigned to several OKC-related cases since then. "Clear case of suicide," she announced before the forensics team had even finished processing the scene. Officer Yeakey was obviously distraught about what he witnessed during the bombing. PTSD, guilt over not saving more people. He drove out here to end his suffering. "With what gun?" I asked. Agent Chen looked annoyed. "What? You said he shot himself. Where's the weapon?" "We're still processing the scene. They never found a gun. Not that day. Not ever." So he slashed his wrists, cut up his arms, somehow strangled himself, walked a mile through rough terrain while bleeding out, then shot himself in the head with a gun that disappeared, I said to Agent Chen. Stranger things have happened. But they hadn't. Not in 20 years of police work. The blood evidence told a different story. There was no blood trail from the car to where Terry's body was found. If he'd cut his wrists at the car and walked that distance, there should have been a clear path of blood drops. Instead, the first blood was found about 50 yards from the body. Like he was carried or dragged most of the way, the forensics photographer told me quietly, but don't quote me on that. Terry's family was devastated and confused. His ex-wife Tonya insisted he'd never talked about suicide. His sister said he'd seemed excited about something recently, not depressed. "He called me 2 days ago," Tonya told investigators. Said he was finally going to get some answers, that people were going to know the truth. The official investigation lasted exactly 1 week. Agent Chen concluded that Officer Terence Yeakey had killed himself due to severe PTSD related to his experiences during the Oklahoma City bombing response. Case closed. But when Terry's family went to collect his personal effects from his apartment, they found it had already been cleaned out. Federal agents had been there first. Said they were looking for evidence related to his mental state, Tonya was told, for the investigation. Terry's safety deposit box was also emptied. The bank manager said federal agents had presented a court order. When Terry's lawyer requested a copy of the order, he was told it was sealed for national security reasons. "Everything's gone," Terry's sister called to tell me. "His files, his photographs, his journals, they took everything." Even his service weapon was missing from the evidence room. The gun that should have been logged and secured when his body was found was nowhere to be found. Clerical error, I was told when I asked about it. Sometimes things get misfiled. The ones who claimed to protect us cleaned up before we could ask why he died. At Terry's funeral, I counted at least 6 federal agents in attendance. They didn't participate in the service, just watched from the back, taking notes, recording who came, who spoke, who seemed upset or angry. Agent Chen approached me afterward. Officer Yiki was obviously troubled, she said. Sometimes good cops get too deep into conspiracy theories, start seeing connections that aren't there. It's a tragedy, but it happens. What about his evidence? What evidence? We didn't find any evidence, just the confused notes of a man suffering from severe psychological trauma. That night I went to Terry's bank, told them I was his partner, investigating his death. The safety deposit box attendant was nervous. "Those federal agents," she said quietly. "They were here before we even heard about Officer Yiki's death. How'd they know to come here if he'd just been found?" I didn't have an answer for that either. It's been 28 years since Terry died. 28 years since my friend and fellow officer was found dead in a field, with wounds that told a story the government didn't want anyone to read. I'm retired now, moved away from Oklahoma City in 2003, changed my name in 2008. I tell people I'm paranoid, and maybe I am, but I'm alive, which is more than I can say for several people who asked too many questions about April 19th, 1995. Terry wasn't the only first responder who started asking uncomfortable questions about the bombing. Officer Gordon Martin died in a car accident in 1997, a single vehicle crash, no witnesses. Paramedic James Norris died of a heart attack in 1998, age 34, no history of heart problems. Fire Captain Jeff Kautzman committed suicide in 2000, according to the official report, though his family insisted he'd never shown signs of depression. All of them had been at the Murrah building that morning. All of them had seen things that didn't match the official story. I kept quiet for a long time, told myself that Terry's death really had been suicide, that my suspicions were just grief and paranoia. But time has a way of clarifying things, and the older I get, the more certain I become that my friend was murdered for what he knew. The Oklahoma City bombing was the worst domestic terrorist attack in American history until 9/11. It changed how we think about security, about government buildings, about the threat of homegrown extremism. It justified new laws, new powers, new levels of surveillance. But what if the official story is wrong? What if Terry was right about federal involvement? What if Timothy McVeigh was just the visible part of a larger operation? I've spent decades thinking about what Terry found in that building, the evidence he collected, the photographs that showed federal agents in places they shouldn't have been, at times that didn't make sense. In his final weeks, Terry talked about a package that federal agents had extracted from the building while rescue operations were still ongoing, something they'd gone in to retrieve while people were still trapped in the rubble. What was worth more than human lives? Files, maybe, evidence of other operations or people, informants, assets, agents who needed to be extracted before their covers were blown. The ATF had offices in the Murrah building. So did the FBI, the DEA, and the Secret Service. All agencies that conduct classified operations, maintain sensitive files, run informant networks. If you wanted to destroy evidence of government wrongdoing, a terrorist attack would be perfect cover. Blame the destruction on Timothy McVeigh. Use the tragedy to justify expanded powers and eliminate anyone who saw too much. Terry saw too much. I think about him often, especially on April 19th each year. I think about the man who ran into a collapsing building to save strangers, who pulled 4 people from the rubble, who held a dying child in his arms and promised her everything would be okay. That man deserved better than to die alone in a field, tortured and murdered for trying to uncover the truth. His medal is probably sitting in some government warehouse now, alongside all the evidence they confiscated from his apartment and safety deposit box. A hero's commendation for a man they killed to keep quiet. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Terry had just kept his mouth shut, if he'd accepted the official story and let the inconsistencies slide. He might still be alive today, retired maybe, playing with grandchildren. But that wasn't Terry. He was a cop who believed in justice, even when justice put him in danger, especially then. If there's one thing I want people to remember about Terrence Yiki, it's that he died trying to tell the truth. In an age when truth seems increasingly negotiable, when official stories are crafted by committees and focus groups, Terry represents something pure, something honourable. He saw what he saw, he documented what he could, he asked the questions that needed asking. and they killed him for it. I've never spoken publicly about any of this before, never put these thoughts on paper, but I'm old now, and the people who silenced Terry might not care as much about silencing me. Or maybe they will, and this will be the last thing I write. If something happens to me, if I die in a car accident or have a sudden heart attack or commit suicide in some implausible way, remember that I was in good health when I wrote this. Remember that I had no reason to kill myself. Remember that I was careful. The truth about Oklahoma City died with Terry in that field outside El Reno, but questions remain. Evidence exists somewhere, and maybe, someday, someone braver than me will find it and share it with the world. Until then, we're left with the official story. Timothy McVeigh, lone wolf domestic terrorist, fertilizer bomb, 168 dead. But if Terry was right, if federal agents were inside that building before the explosion, if evidence was extracted while people died in the rubble, if the whole thing was something other than what we've been told, then we're living with a lie that cost 168 lives and continues to shape American policy today. If he killed himself, why did they erase everything he left behind? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. 28 years later, it's the question that haunts me more than any other. Terry knew something worth killing for, and now, so do you.